It is late July 1944. The summer heat in Normandy is not the pleasant warmth of the French countryside. It is a suffocating, dusty blanket that smells of cordite, unwashed bodies, and the sickly sweet scent of rotting cattle bloated in the sun. For 7 weeks, the greatest invasion force in human history has been stuck. The Allies, who stormed the beaches on D-Day with the promise of liberating Europe, are now drowning in a sea of hedgerows. To the soldiers on the ground, the war has become a knife fight in a phone booth. The American advance is measured not in miles, but in yards. Every field is a fortress. Every thicket of brush hides a German machine gun, or the terrifying high-velocity cannon of a Tiger tank. The morale of the Allied forces is beginning to curdle. In the newspapers back home, the headlines are asking why the mighty American war machine has stalled. And at the very top of the command chain, the Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight D, Eisenhower, is under pressure that would crush a lesser man. Eisenhower is a man of logistics, of diplomacy, and of careful planning. He smokes 4 packs of cigarettes a day. His hand shakes slightly when he holds his coffee. He knows that if the Allies are contained in Normandy, if they cannot break out before the autumn rains turn the ground to mud, the invasion could fail. The Germans are rushing reinforcements to the front. The window of opportunity is closing. Eisenhower needs a miracle. Or, perhaps, he simply needs a monster. Sitting on the sidelines, in a kind of purgatory of his own making, is the one general the Germans fear more than any other, George S. Patton. He is the polar opposite of Eisenhower. Ike is the manager. Patton is the gladiator. Patton believes in reincarnation. He believes he marched with Caesar and fought with Napoleon. He wears ivory-handled revolvers on his hips and laces his speeches with profanity that makes seasoned sergeants blush. But Patton is currently in the doghouse. After the infamous slapping incidents in Sicily, where he struck shell-shocked soldiers, he has been benched. He was used as a decoy, a phantom threat to keep the Germans guessing, while other men led the invasion. But now, with a stalemate grinding the Allied armies into dust, Eisenhower knows he has no choice. He has to unleash the rabid dog. He has to put Patton in command of the newly formed Third Army and tell him to do the one thing George Patton was born to do, attack. The relationship between Eisenhower and Patton is one of the most complex in military history. They are friends, old comrades who have known each other for decades, but they are also rivals. Eisenhower is the younger man, yet he is the boss. Patton, the senior officer by years and experience, finds himself answering to a man he once tutored on tank warfare. It gnaws at him. But Eisenhower understands something about Patton that no one else does. He knows that Patton walks a fine line between genius and madness. He knows that to get the best out of Patton, you have to let him run, but you also have to hold the leash tight enough to keep him from hanging himself. The plan to break the deadlock is codenamed Operation Cobra. It is a gamble. It relies on the use of massive air power to carpet bomb a narrow sector of the German line, obliterating the defenses and creating a hole. Through that hole, the American armor is supposed to pour through, but the breakout is only the beginning. The real question is what happens once the tanks are in the open. Do they play it safe? Do they consolidate? Or do they risk everything on a drive that defies the laws of logistics and sanity? On the morning of July 25th, the sky turned black with bombers. The ground shakes so violently that men miles away fall to their knees. The German Panzer Division, an elite unit, is practically vaporized. The hole is open. The American First Army begins to push through, but the momentum is sluggish. The Germans are rallying. It is messy. It is chaotic. And then on August 1st, George Patton's Third Army is officially activated. It is like flipping a switch. The energy of the entire front changes. Patton does not believe in digging in. He does not believe in sleep. He issues an order that terrifies the supply officers, but electrifies his tank crews. We're going to go so fast that the enemy won't have time to set their fuses. Patton's columns begin to move. And they don't just move, they sprint. He ignores a standard military doctrine that says you must secure your flanks. When his subordinates worry about the Germans attacking the side of his long, stretching column, Patton barks back that he doesn't care about his flanks. He says, let the enemy worry about their flanks. I'll shoot up their rear. Back at Supreme Headquarters, the maps are changing by the hour. The markers representing Patton's divisions are moving faster than the intelligence officers can pin them to the board. Eisenhower is watching this unfold. He is surrounded by British commanders like Bernard Montgomery, who are methodical, cautious, and obsessed with preparation. They look at Patton's advance with horror. They see a disaster waiting to happen. They see an army overextended, vulnerable, reckless. But Eisenhower sees something else. He sees the German line shattering. The Germans have never dealt with this kind of speed. They are masters of mobile warfare, the inventors of blitzkrieg, but now they are being fed a dose of their own medicine. Patton is moving faster than their communications can travel. By the time a German commander reports that American tanks are in a certain town, Patton is already 20 miles past it. He is bypassing strong points, cutting phone lines, seizing bridges before they can be blown. The tension in Eisenhower's headquarters is palpable. The reports coming in are almost unbelievable. Patton has taken Avranches. Now he is pushing into Brittany. Now he is turning east. He is doing the impossible. He is pivoting an entire army 90 degrees while in combat and driving them into the soft underbelly of the German forces. There's a moment, a specific window of time in early August, where the realization hits. The stalemate is not just broken. It is obliterated. Eisenhower, the man who carries the weight of the free world on his shoulders, the man who writes letters of resignation in his head every night in case of failure, receives a briefing. The briefing details the position of the Third Army. They are miles ahead of schedule. They have captured thousands of prisoners. They are rolling up the German line from the side and rear. It is said that when Eisenhower fully grasped the magnitude of what Patton was achieving, the mask of the stoic diplomat slipped. The endless smoking, the furrowed brow, the constant diplomacy, it all vanished for a second. He didn't just nod. He didn't just sign a paper. He erupted. The exact words vary in the retelling, filtered through the memories of staff officers in the haze of victory, but the sentiment was a shout of pure, unadulterated vindication. It was a shout of a man who had bet his career and the lives of millions on a madman and won. He famously exclaimed to his staff, his face breaking into that wide, Kansas grin, "By God, he's done it. We've got them on the run." But there is a more intimate moment, a communication between the two men that defines his victory. As Patton's tanks were tearing through the French countryside, creating a corridor of chaos, the concern for his open flank reached a fever pitch at headquarters. The other generals were screaming that Patton was going to be cut off. They demanded he stop. They demanded he dig in. Eisenhower, feeling the pressure, contacted Patton. He asked about the flank. He asked how Patton intended to protect a line of supply that was stretching thin and exposed to counterattack. Patton's response was legendary. He radioed back that he didn't have the manpower to guard the flank with soldiers. Instead, he said he would protect his flank with aircraft. He demanded the 19 Tactical Air Command cover his right side. It was unheard of. It was risky. Eisenhower stood at the map. He looked at the vast emptiness on Patton's flank. He looked at the cautious advice of his other commanders. And then he shouted the order that would seal the fate of the German army in France. Let him go. It wasn't just a command. It was a release. It was Eisenhower realizing that standard rules no longer applied. He shouted down the naysayers. He shouted down the caution. Let him go. Give him the air support. Give him the gas. This is the pivotal moment of the war in the West. If Eisenhower had hesitated, if he had listened to the prudent advice to halt Patton and secure the line, the Germans might have regrouped. The war could have dragged on into 1945 with the borders of France still contested. But Eisenhower shouted for speed. The result is the Falaise pocket. Because Patton is allowed to run, he circles around the German 7th Army like a wolf pack. He drives deep into their rear, linking up with the Canadians and the Polish forces to create a sack. Inside that sack are tens of thousands of German soldiers, hundreds of tanks, and the pride of the Wehrmacht. The roads inside the pocket become a slaughterhouse. Allied fighter bombers, the very ones Eisenhower authorized to protect Patton's flank, turn the retreating German columns into burning scrap metal. The destruction is so absolute that pilots report being sickened by the smell of burning flesh rising up to their cockpits. Eisenhower later toured the battlefield at Falaise. He was a man who had seen war, but he had never seen this. He described it as a scene from Dante's Inferno. It was possible, he wrote, to walk for hundreds of yards stepping only on decaying flesh and twisted metal, never touching the ground. This was the fruit of Patton's speed and Eisenhower's decision to unleash him. But the story of Eisenhower and Patton is not a fairy tale. It is a tragedy of conflicting personalities. Even as Eisenhower is shouting his praise for Patton's advance, the seeds of their next conflict are being sown. Patton does not want to stop at the Seine River. He wants to keep going. He screams that he can be in Germany in 10 days. He begs for gas. He begs for bullets. Eisenhower, however, has to look at the whole map. He has Montgomery in the north, demanding supplies. He has the liberation of Paris to manage, a political nightmare that Patton cares nothing about. Eisenhower has to become the manager again. He has to pull the leash. When the order comes to halt the Third Army because the fuel supplies are running dry and have to be shared with Montgomery, Patton is apoplectic. He rages. He curses Eisenhower's name. He claims that Ike is playing politics with British generals while American boys are dying. Eisenhower hears the reports of Patton's insubordination. He hears the insults. A lesser commander would have fired Patton right then and there. But Eisenhower remembers the shout. He remembers the feeling of the breakout. He knows that he needs Patton, even if he hates him sometimes. There's a profound lesson in what happened during that breakout. It is a lesson about leadership. Eisenhower was not a brilliant tactician in the way Patton was. He couldn't read a battlefield from the turret of a tank, but he was a brilliant judge of character. He knew that in war, there is a time for caution, and there is a time for chaos. The shout that rang out in the headquarters wasn't just about moving pieces on a map. It was an expression of trust. Eisenhower had to trust Patton enough to let him break the rules. He had to trust that Patton's madness was actually a higher form of sanity. Consider the risk Eisenhower took. Patton was a public relations nightmare. If the Third Army had been cut off and destroyed because of Patton's reckless speed, the blame would not have fallen on Patton alone. It would have fallen on Eisenhower. The press would have destroyed him. Why did you give the disgraced general command? Why did you let him ignore his flanks? It would have been the end of Eisenhower's career and possibly the end of the Allied alliance. When Eisenhower shouted, "Let him go," he was pushing his entire life's work onto the table and letting it ride on the spin of the wheel. And Patton delivered. He delivered the spectacular liberation of France in weeks, a campaign that military planners thought would take months. He drove the Germans back across the Rhine with their heads spinning. But let us zoom in on the specific day the German line truly snapped. July 31st leading into August 1st, Avranches is the bottleneck. It is a small town with a bridge network that acts as a funnel into the rest of France. If the Americans take it, the door is open. If the Germans hold it, the Allies are bottled up. Patton is personally directing traffic. He stands in the middle of the road, dust coating his face, his high-pitched voice cutting through the roar of diesel engines. He is waving tanks forward like a traffic cop. He sees a tank commander hesitate. Patton runs up to the tank, bangs on the side with his riding crop, and screams at the man to move or he'll kick him all the way to Berlin himself. The soldiers see this. They see the old man, old blood and guts, standing in the open, defying sniper fire, demanding speed. It changes them. They stop being cautious. They press the accelerator. When word reaches Eisenhower that Patton is personally pushing columns through the Avranches Gap, ignoring the chaos, ignoring a lack of sleep, that is when the relief washes over the Supreme Commander. The shout is the release of 7 weeks of agony. The hedging, the hedgerows, the stalemate, it's over. The documentary footage from this time shows the result. We see the laughing French civilians throwing flowers onto the Sherman tanks. We see the long lines of dejected German prisoners. But what we don't see is the quiet solitude of Eisenhower's office late at night, the smoke hanging in the air, looking at the map where the blue line of the Third Army is slashing like a razor across the canvas. He likely poured himself a drink, sat back, and realized that the gamble of the century had paid off. However, the dynamic between these two men would never be simple. As the war dragged into the winter, toward the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower would have to call on Patton again. And again, Patton would promise the impossible. When the Germans launched their massive surprise attack in the Ardennes, shattering the American lines, Eisenhower called a meeting of his generals. Everyone was gloomy. Everyone was talking about retreat and containment. Eisenhower looked at Patton. "George, how long will it take you to turn your army 90 degrees and attack the German flank?" It was a maneuver that should have taken weeks. Patton didn't blink. He said, "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The other generals laughed. They thought he was boasting. They thought he was the madman again. But Eisenhower didn't laugh. He remembered the breakout. He remembered the summer. He looked at Patton and saw the fire that had burned through France. "Go," Eisenhower said, and Patton did it. He turned an entire army on a dime in the snow and broke the siege of Bastogne. This relationship, the shouted orders, the silent understandings, the public reprimands, and the private admirations, is the engine that drove the Allied victory in Europe. Eisenhower provided the structure. Patton provided the velocity. Eisenhower was a shield. Patton was a sword. To understand what Eisenhower shouted when Patton crushed the German line, we have to understand that it wasn't a specific catchphrase. It was the sound of the dam breaking. It was the sound of the modern world overpowering the old. The Germans fought for an ideology of hate, but they fought with a rigid, top-down structure where initiative was often stifled by the madman in Berlin. The Americans, for all their lack of discipline, for all their chaotic supply lines, fought with a spirit of improvisation, and no one embodied that improvisation more than Patton. Eisenhower's genius was not that he could do what Patton did. His genius was that he recognized it, tolerated it, and aimed it at the enemy. As the dust settled on the Normandy campaign and the Allied armies raced toward the German border, a letter was written. Eisenhower wrote to General Marshall, the chief of staff back in Washington. In it, he praised Patton's operational brilliance. He admitted that Patton was difficult, temperamental, and a headache, but he concluded that no one else could have done what Patton did. The shout of victory was ultimately a shout of validation. It proved that the American way of war, fast, mechanized, overwhelming, and slightly reckless, was superior to the German military tradition. Imagine the scene one last time. The war room, the teleprinters clattering, the air thick with tobacco smoke. The aide rushes in with a decrypt from ultra-intelligence or the field report from the Third Army. "General, Patton has cleared the Seine. The German 7th Army is effectively destroyed." Eisenhower stands up. The weight of the thousands of boys who died on Omaha Beach, the weight of the paratroopers hanging in the trees of St. Miraglise, the weight of the mothers waiting for telegrams back home. It lifts. He slams his hand on the table. He's done it. That energy, that moment of breakthrough, is the turning point of the 20th century. It is the moment Nazi Germany truly lost the war. They could delay, they could bleed the Allies, but they could no longer hope to throw them back into the sea. The beast was loose in Europe, and its name was the Third Army. In the end, history remembers the generals in marble statues and somber portraits. We see Eisenhower as the bald, grandfatherly president he would become. We see Patton as a caricature from the movie, standing in front of a giant flag. But we must remember them as they were in that hot, desperate summer of 1944. Two men, utterly different, bound together by the necessity of victory. One shouted, "Go!" The other went, and together they broke the back of the Third Reich. As the sun set on the European theater, the legacy of that breakout remained. It rewrote the textbooks on tank warfare. It cemented the United States as the dominant military power on Earth. And it proved that sometimes the prudent thing to do is to be imprudent. Sometimes the only way to win is to throw the map out the window and drive until the gas runs out. Eisenhower knew this. Patton lived this. And in the echo of that shout, the liberation of Europe was secured. The hedgerows were behind them. The open road to Berlin lay ahead. And though the road would be bloody and the winter would be hard, the end was no longer in doubt. The team of Ike and George had done the impossible. They had turned the stalemate of Normandy into the greatest foot race in military history. And the world is different today because of it.